Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar from ASCM and the San Diego chapter. Is our first webinar of the year. So as we go out through the year, the intent is to do a monthly webinar, and I'm pleased to start this year and this monthly series with Peter Murray, that's going to be our guest speaker, talking about the SCOR and how to use SCOR to tackle some of the supply chain challenges. Peter, I will let you the floor.
It's terrific to be here. Tonight we're talking about SCOR and really about the practical application of SCOR and my experience in doing that. So I'm excited to share this. Let me try presentation mode. Okay. And just so I don't distract myself, I'm going to turn my camera off and I will rejoin at the end when we go through the exercise and have some questions. So just a quick introduction of myself. I've been involved with SCOR for, I was trying to count, 20 plus years. So I've been involved in everything from getting certified with SCOR, using SCOR, being a SCOR instructor, contributing back to SCOR 12, and now SCOR's, I think it was not 13, but SCOR DS. So a lot of experience with it. I've been involved in ASCM and APEX before that in a lot of different ways. Currently, I'm part of the Eco-Sustainability SIG in the San Diego chapter. I've been involved in a sustainable supply chain SIG for the APEX board and did some board service a few years back. I also helped develop the SCOR-P certification, which continues to grow in its reach and its capability. From a work perspective, I've been involved in transforming supply chains and businesses, integrated business planning, and then sustainable and resilient supply chains and operations. So I've been part of ASCM for 30 years, since the beginning of my career, SCOR for about 20. I'm currently in aerospace and defense again. That's where I started my career, and I'm back again. Another big chunk of it was in chemicals and material science, and then I had a mix of a few things in consumer products, pharmaceuticals, and various startups in different ways. So I think at least, and I'll talk about it, I think I have some helpful stuff to share on SCOR, and you guys can definitely give me some feedback on that. So this was on the introductory information we sent out. The only reason I'm bringing this up is there are some links to some articles, and much of this presentation was based on the first one, Tackling Supply Chain Challenges with SCOR. It's a short article that's out on LinkedIn. There's one about understanding how you can leverage SCOR to help with financial performance in any supply chain or business. And then there's an oldie but a goodie, but there's a presentation from back when I worked for DuPont, and we did some major transformation of supply chains. And that's out there. It's kind of a funky format, but just might be interesting to take a look at it. So in terms of today, the learning objective really is to understand the basic elements of SCOR. So it's not really going to be SCOR education. That's a little more time and effort that takes to really fully understand how to utilize it. But we're going to talk about things through stories and examples, and then we're going to end up with a very short exercise of applying a certain aspect of SCOR to the aerospace industry. And the focus is really on how it can be used practically and not in-depth education. There's actually a really great SCOR introductory program you can do on the web through ASCM. So everyone that's a member, you just sign on. It takes a few hours, but it's a great initial introduction to SCOR. And then, SCOR classes are really the best way to learn. And then the best learning is to apply SCOR to different projects. So what I'd like you to come away with is just insight on how the SCOR model can add value, how you apply some of the methods, and then how it can work with other things. And we'll talk about that. So it's not something that's mutually exclusive. It's actually a very inclusive way of approaching any kind of supply chain or business challenge. So we'll do about 35 minutes presentation. We'll have some time for questions. And there'll be a couple of points where I'm going to ask you guys for input as we go along. So where has SCOR helped me? And I was kind of thinking about this question. I was asking myself this and put this together in sort of continuum. So I was thinking back, the first time I'd ever seen SCOR was back in 2002. And it was around a job I was brought into was a joint venture between Dow Chemical and DuPont, and we were small, but really were challenged to try to make it a really world-class business. And so my part of it was a world-class supply chain. Now, of course, no one really knew what that was. So, I started to look around and say, how would you actually define that? And I first came across SCOR as a way to define what that might mean. And so in a lot of cases, the first place you touch on SCOR is often the performance metrics. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of people stop, but that's only the beginning of the journey of getting value out of it. The next thing I got involved with was developing a fix the business model. So I got into an improvement group, and we were asked to fix some businesses that were really struggling. And so we were given kind of an open sort of way to approach that. So we put together a lot of things that we thought would be effective. And one of those was using the SCOR model, but in a fuller sense. So we also had other tools that we could use. We brought in some ethics education. We already had a big infrastructure around Six Sigma, and we began to touch on lean a little bit. So we're just trying anything that would help bring these businesses back to better performance. And so we use SCOR to again define not only the state of performance, but begin to benchmark how it can be better. And then from there, that was successful, and we're able to use it to scale to cover an entire global company made up of many business divisions. And we're able to use something called convergence, which was a great concept, which is a way that you can apply SCOR as a way to define where you are today, where you're trying to go, a roadmap of getting there that applies to supply chains. You can link that to not only performance measures, but the processes that you have in an understandable way, the practices that you can apply, and the state of the practices that you use, and then you can link that to skills. And you can use that to define how skills interact with all those other things. So it's really a complete model. And we started to use that to really pull together all these different efforts we had and scale things. And from there, it became part of an integrated business system. So we brought in everything from high-level S&OP or IBP, as we call it today. We had a whole deployment of lean that went all the way through the operations. We incorporated our Six Sigma analytical piece to it. We brought in financial analysis, and we started to really generate a lot of value. It generated, for many years, it generated a tremendous amount of value. It was very visible and really drove, a lot of additional opportunities on the market side and also with internal improvement. And then from there, I took SCOR and I applied it to some really interesting challenges. One was a sustainable agribusiness model. We were trying to actually build a supply chain for a biofuel that needed to be able to sequester more carbon than it emitted on the additive part of the fuel, not the entire fuel, but it also had to do things like not degrade the soils, not increase runoff. So a lot of things we had to measure. And so we applied SCOR to treat it like a series of supply chains. And it really helped us define and prove the value, and was a big part of how we were defining the value we could bring, and the way that all the different pieces work together like a series of supply chains, and use that to get a big capital investment. I began to really become interested in how you could connect financial analysis to the SCOR model, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, of how you could actually identify where there were real financial opportunities, and you could link the two things together, and then from there you could build the business case for improvement. And then I was able to do more to contribute to the SCOR model. As I mentioned, SCOR 12. I spent quite a few years teaching SCOR, which was a great experience. And now I really, really enjoy what I'm doing now, which is sharing, my SCOR experience with anyone who's interested to learn about the application of SCOR in the real world, because that's the part that sometimes gets missed. It's a great, learning to go through, but it's really developing into something you can use. And it's a very practical and accessible way to do things at any level. So just quickly, what is SCOR and the SCOR model? What makes it useful? Probably the biggest one that I find is it helps define supply chains. So one of the biggest challenges we had when we were trying to really assess a number of different businesses that seem to be different, at least from the perspective of their business teams, was to say, well, actually these businesses are similar, and the supply chains within the businesses are similar. In the case, some businesses produced rolls of things, so sheets of different material. Now, even though the basic material, the way it was developed or produced was different, the chemistry was different, the application was different, was it still was something you produced and sold in rolls. And that was a way that we helped simplify many, many different supply chains down to less than 12 or so, that we could really focus on how do we make those work better. The second thing is it's a process model that can be deployed to understand, simplify, and improve supply chains for any organization. So it's just a standard way that you can approach things and apply it. And it's something that is pretty solid in terms of how it's put together. It's been evolved through a lot of work of a lot of people over a long time. I think it originally was first started in 1996, and it's been an evolving model that's always been built around the input of practitioners. So it's a very useful and solid model. And third, it's a method to define the current state, identify potential, and create a path to the future. So that's where you get a lot of value out of it. So this is the ASCM definition of supply chain. And the reason I bring this up is because obviously supply chains and the networks of supply chains can get pretty complex, and they involve a lot of different elements. Many of them tend to be global or connected to global supply chains, and they start with literally raw materials or things coming out of the ground. And if you look at a circular supply chain, hopefully we're returning those things back to continued use and minimizing waste. Right? So there's a lot of complexity, and supply chains involve the flows of more than just materials. So one of the things that SCOR does, and this is from the current SCOR content, is it helps define that supply chains are not just simply materials, but it involves the flow of information, which is becoming ever more digitized. And so you have huge amounts of information you have to deal with now. Some of it's useful, some of it's not. But all of that you have to consider in how you manage your supply chains. And then, of course, the flow, the financial flow, is a critical part of any supply chain. In terms of being a standardized model, now we're not going to get into a lot of depth here, but the key thing to understand about the SCOR model is it's based around something called a process decomposition model. And all that really means is you start at a high level, at a level that's visible, in the case of the SCOR model, around a business model or a strategy, and how you actually orchestrate your supply chain. And it then allows you to break things down into major processes, where it defines the scope and content and performance targets of the supply chain. And then you get down into the next level, and it defines operations strategy, process capabilities are set there. And then you go further into the different process elements and how they're configured. And not only the configuration of how processes fit together, but even the geographic configuration of your supply chain, which is very important to consider. And then SCOR can continue to go below that into a series of identifiable transactions and activities that you can apply different improvement methods to. So just simply to understand that this is a model that you can break things down from a high level to a low level and build them back up. And you can do the same thing across supply chains and between supply chains. And then SCOR also has built into it an aligned set of performance attributes at a high level, which are ways to really understand the alignment to the business model and the strategy. And then you have a series of metrics that break down from there that are aligned to the process model that allow you to measure performance down to the process level. And then if you can measure performance, you can define whether there's an improvement opportunity or how to better manage it. As I said before, those are also aligned to the skills that are required to manage those processes. And then what I think is one of the most important parts of how SCOR works together is it's really a way to move from the current state to an improved future state. And one of the things that people will often say about SCOR is, oh, I've heard this somewhere else. Well, it's really a coming together of a lot of good things that work in a lot of places and putting it in the context of supply chains and the logic of the SCOR model. So it is about business process reengineering. I often said when I used to teach the class, it's about the supply chain. And it's to capture the as-is state of a business and then try to figure out what the desired future state is and how you can get there. Benchmarking is a really important part of the SCOR model, and there's something called the SCOR racetrack, or used to be called the SCOR project, which is how you define those opportunities. And an important part of that is benchmarking. That benchmarking can be done through a service like PwC still has a really deep database, APQC. You can go to them and get different things. But even if you're just measuring yourself against the best performance you've run or between your own business units, benchmarking really gives you a definition of what that improvement is. And SCOR is built around benchmarking your metrics. You can compare processes, you can compare practices, and you can even benchmark against the way that skills are set up or aligned to a process. It then gives you that best practices analysis. So what are the best things you can do to improve the performance that you have? And how should you deploy those? Because it might seem like, oh, I want to have everything to be the best practice possible. Well, that may not be achievable or maybe too much of a stretch, but you can build yourself towards doing that and repeat this kind of process of improvement. And then because it's a process model, it allows you to capture all this in an understandable way and to be able to communicate about performance and about how you can drive improvement to that. So any questions so far on what SCOR is? Does anyone feel like I missed anything about SCOR? We've got some SCOR experts out there.
Yeah, Peter, a quick question. Jim McNeil here. On the benchmarking, I believe you mentioned that benchmarking against your own internal metrics, your own, or other divisions of your company. What would you say is the percentage of companies that never get beyond that level of benchmarking?
I would say probably, in my experience, I'd say probably 75% of companies never really get beyond a very simple level of benchmarking. And I'll tell you why. One, because it's not always easy to get at real data, and sometimes it's expensive. And so when I say, benchmark against your own performance, I remember that, when we kind of realized that was when we were struggling to get enough, detail of benchmarks. And there was always the question of more. I think someone, I can't remember who said it, maybe someone that was helping us, said, well, what's the best performance you've ever had? And that lit up a light bulb. But at least you can define performance that you believe is the best you've had before. Can you meet that? And then once you build a case for that, you can then define the value of going out and investing in additional information. And there's some great services to get it. You can do it yourself. When we did it at a large company, we built a team and a capability to do a mix of performance benchmarking and financial benchmarking against competition or against attribute companies. So trying to be like other companies in other industries and really looking at their performance. So if you start just as simply as possible with something then you can build the case for value for investing further and more benchmarking information. Did that help?
That did. Great. Thank you very much.
Any other questions about SCOR itself? So we're going to dive in a little bit more of stories and application. All right, great. So one of the things I really like about SCOR is, and I've always liked this, is that, and somebody can look up the definition of the word elegant while I'm talking, and I'll talk about why I often use that term. SCOR is put together in an elegant approach. It's both practical and actionable, both internally and externally. So even though it's a pretty picture, SCOR has always had a really logical connection of how things come together. And it makes reasonable sense, again, because it's come through a lot of people and their real world experience to develop something that's understandable and build a model that almost acts as building blocks of putting together either building supply chains or putting together a better supply chain. So did anyone have a chance to look up the word elegant? So if you didn't, I think I've got it right here. So one of the things that always I liked about the definition of elegant is it's about simplification, right? So it's not usually the first one. So in a case of a scientific theory or solution to a problem, it's pleasingly ingenious and simple, right? So why I like to use that term is because it really provides simplification of complexity. And supply chains are nothing if not complex, especially when you have a lot of them coming together in your own organization, or when you look at all your partners and suppliers, right? That becomes very complex very fast. And if you look at the illustration in the lower right, this is kind of building off the original view of kind of the end-to-end value stream look at supply chain. So, usually say I'm looking at my customers through suppliers in terms of looking at my supply chain. Now you can keep extending that model or network it, but within SCOR, you're looking at the market drivers, you're looking for end-to-end visibility, and you're looking at the potential for collaboration. And that's why, to me, it's a very elegant approach. So let's talk a little bit more about some experience I've had in applying different things. So the article that I included was from 2022, and it was about supply chain challenges. And I think that all 6 of these still apply today. And I think maybe there's, some things that have changed a little bit around, rapid adoption of automation. It's both digital and physical. And then the other one I think is really important to point out. And, there are some great posts from, I think it was the UN or Davos or something recently, but it was talking about skills of today and skills of tomorrow. And one of the things that's in there is the importance of a range of critical and creative thinking skills. And I think you can apply that to any of it. And I know in the industry I'm now, aerospace and defense, one of the challenges we've long had is we have lost people, and that accelerated a little bit after COVID or through COVID, was skilled machinists that knew how to make parts. They knew literally by feel and by experience how to make critical aerospace parts. And because we've lost some of those people, and interesting enough, I had that same experience at the beginning of my career as the World War II generation of skilled machinists were retiring out or passing away, is that you can't just automate everything, right? You need to understand fundamentally what you're dealing with. And sometimes that is built over time in processes that aren't always documented or captured. And so the ability to think through things is really critical. And I think that applies to almost anything that we deal with, and certainly in supply chain. Does anyone else have any thoughts about, what are the challenges of today? So in the article, I talked about, business value. And one of the challenges of getting business value is deploying a strategy. So one, there's a lot of work that goes into defining and developing strategies. The other one is deploying them and then being able to execute. Another one, and one that, is really a big part of what I do today, because my job today is more on the customer management and general management side in aerospace. So I am always dealing with, are we meeting customer expectations or not, or hearing from customers when we may not be, and then expecting the same through our supply chain and value chain back to our suppliers. So understanding how you can actually deliver customer value and defining what that is really important. The third one is profitability. And profitability is critical for any organization. Even a nonprofit has a form of profitability. Are you achieving your mission? Are you able to use the money that you have successfully? Any organization has some element of that kind of thinking. This is critical, especially in the face of the disruption we face in many supply chains today. Certainly, the inflationary pressures we've experienced in the last couple of years. And then one thing that is definitely always occurring is new demand patterns. We saw that through COVID. In the aerospace industry, we saw a dramatic drop in demand for civil aviation. Defense stayed fairly steady, but civil dropped by almost 50%. And then it came roaring back, and it came back in different ways. Different airframes were in demand. Many airlines tried to hold the line on using the planes they had and did different things to upgrade. So demand patterns can shift pretty dramatically. So maintaining profitability through that is really critical. The other one is risk management, and there's great work that's been done in a lot of different places. One of the early pioneers was a guy named Greg Schlegel, which he's done a lot through APIX. You may have seen some of his stuff with the Supply Chain Risk Consortium with a guy named Jim DeVries. They're always, sharing what they do. They really kind of brought that up as a really critical thing that you could manage through supply chain management. And obviously, we see a lot of risk today. So one of the things that's important is to understand that risk, understand your own supply chain, your own business, your own operations, and be in that benchmarking kind of mindset of saying, all right, are we anticipating the need to change, sensing outside your organization, and having plans on the shelf if you need to shift what you're doing. And then the one that's also very important is supplier and partner relations, right? So how do you effectively communicate and collaborate? As we increasingly digitize supply chains, that communication is really important. We're communicating in different ways. The volume of information is much higher. Where that information is sourced, literally from a gazillion sensors and anything these days, right? How do you use that information effectively? We're taking in all this, social information that's being fed back to companies and supply chains in different ways. And so how do you take all of that and use that effectively in managing the relationship you have with those supply chains? And then the last one, and I think still the most important, is talent management and the speed to shifting those skills the areas that you need it and sustaining that productivity is always very important. And if it's not for people and it's not for those critical and creative thinking skills, all that wonderful technology doesn't do us a lot of good. So are there any other thoughts on challenges of today that I might have missed?
I would say this, Preston, that following the retirement of the boomer generation was an issue unto itself, but a mistake that was made, I'm talking aerospace and defense now, in context, the decision that was made that has proven to be faulty was the premature celebration of a peace dividend. And in the mid-90s, we didn't lose machinists yet. It was on a decline. And those skills that are a bit artisan in nature, really, we lost a lot of engineering talent, and we didn't keep our eye on the ball. So we're really right today in between a rock and a hard place, in that when it comes to the amount of talent to ramp up what is genuinely needed with all the turmoil around the globe, it really takes ingenuity to work with a dwindled resource, a compromised set of resources, both intellectual and physical. So there's some real challenges out there today in A&D, and I would say the challenges are there also for pharma because of the need to reconfigure supply chains, particularly for healthcare. But it wasn't just the erosion of skills to make something. It was there's been an erosion in skills to actually engineer something. If you look at our NASA's latest effort, excluding SpaceX, they've really had a really embarrassing set of circumstance. They've taken something that was engineered before that worked, and they can't make it work now. So it's just not the skill in crafting, it's the skill in engineering, and we've really fallen off a cliff. But the need to make parts, engineer parts, still exists. So just thought
Absolutely.
I'd make that.
No, absolutely. And then even today, if you look at the news of the last week, where you've got a Boeing plane that maybe was missing bolts in a door plug, they called it, but which is basically a false door. That's wasn't our business, but the company that installed it in Boeing are certainly customers of ours, and I do know a lot about fasteners, so it's a big part of what we do. And just having the lack of the kind of process management that would allow something like that to potentially happen, if it's not known for sure now, but if those bolts were actually missing or not properly installed or even designed to be installed properly. So you're absolutely right. So a lot of risk out there and a lot of things we need to do to understand, how to build back those capabilities in the aerospace industry while we're facing tremendous growth and a lot of change. So often it feels like this to me. So I started my life and early career on boats, right? Even before I went to college. So I often think in those terms. So it often feels chaotic, like big waves are coming at us, and you're fighting to adjust the sails, and it's always a challenging environment. Well, one of the things about SCOR is that it can really calm chaos, and that's been my experience, and simplify complexity. There's a lot of work you need to do to get there, but it can really make a big difference. Now, I won't comment a little bit on risk container ships because they have their own, but just the idea that, SCOR can help you update technology, and along your supply chain, it can increase the skills or redirect the skills you have. It can help you gain investment and prepare for what's next, or be a way to facilitate those things happening. One of the key things is how SCOR aligns around deploying business value. So in the SCOR model, there's 3 key areas: performance attributes, which help you align to your business model and strategy. There's metrics, which are below those that you can apply to processes and use for direct comparison. And then there's processes and really around practices that are within those processes, which, when you look at practices, the way the SCOR model looks at it is they go from emerging all the way up to best. And there's also a category of processes that are in decline. And why is that important? Well, if you're assessing or benchmarking your practices, you probably want to be more towards the mature practices, and in some cases, really trying to attain best practices where they apply. In some cases, you may want to be investigating or have an eye on emerging practices and see how they apply to your organization, your business. One of the things we'll get to at the very end of this is talking more about how you align those attributes, which is in the lower right, to your strategy, and how some of that may change, for example, in the aerospace industry. So there's customer-facing ones, and ASCM has done a really great job of expanding SCOR to include more things. But it was originally built around internal cost and asset-based measures, and then customer-facing ones around reliability, responsiveness, and agility, and aligning those to your strategy, and then aligning them to how your supply chains were deployed against the markets you were targeting. And we're not going to get into depth in this because this is a fairly evolved area, but this is one of the really interesting parts of SCOR, is to align your supply chains to see, do they actually match up to the markets you're trying to serve? And it's a really great exercise in SCOR to go through some of that. And it can be very surprising because it explains sometimes where they don't. And that explains why sometimes it's extremely challenging to do everything from bring products to market to see them succeed, despite, all the effort that's gone into them, if you don't have the supply chains correctly aligned to that. And then, as I mentioned, supply chain strategy, we'll talk a little more about in the end, is aligning to what you're really trying to drive. And one of the things that SCOR does, just as a way to kind of promote thinking, is, what is the most leading thing you're trying to do? And then what are the things that will support that? Because often, I remember we were doing some work, everyone said, I want to be the best in everything, right? Well, it's actually not really possible, and you need to kind of be the things that are going to get you where you need to go in your markets, your industry. Some industries have a much higher level of requirements for performance, like automotive, it's very high. Aerospace is high in different ways. Some are less so. So it's always a balance of what fits your industry, your competition, your business, organization, the market you're in. So one of the nice things about SCOR, and again, this is not a deep dive into SCOR, but SCOR has expanded to include what they call resilience, which are the typical reliability, responsiveness, and agility. So how your supply chain can perform with more of they're calling it economic or financial. So cost, they've added profit, and I was mentioning in my article how important profit is, and then asset management. And then the other piece that they've really built out, which is hugely valuable, is environmental and social. So those are 2 really important things to our organization, and the work that Preston's been driving, eco-sustainability and the connection to ESG, really needs to look at those things, and SCOR gives you now with SCOR DS a way to do that. So here's something that's a good way to measure if you think your strategy is working. So this comes from Gartner. If you ever feel like strategy and operations are not aligned, and for Gartner's research, only 30% of supply chain leaders feel that way. I'd say probably, it's even a lower figure when you get further down in the organization. I think part of it, you can look at performance and how you're measured. Another one is, what kind of resource investments made, how those resources allocated. And then another one that I always look to is, what are stated strategies versus what you see operationally? And then ultimately, how does it feel? Does it feel like you're doing the right things? Are you facing huge amounts of friction? Is what's being said or projected you're doing aligned to what you're capable of doing and what resources you're providing? So, that's an important place to look. Because still using boats and ships, a polished strategy that looks good may not reflect reality or change. So this is a picture of a famous ship that didn't anticipate the environment it was going to be in, and kept on going with the same strategy until it definitely wouldn't work anymore. So a good strategy is executable. So the nice thing about the SCOR model is it really defines whether you can execute something. So if you can execute it, you're more likely to have success, even with a strategy that isn't all that great. If it's executable, it's more likely to be successful than one that struggles to be executed. So the next one is customer value. So customer value is really based on meeting customer expectations, and it's central to the the philosophy of lean. It's a key part of what's in SCOR. Is, are you able to define what the expectation is, and are you able to deliver it against that, and how does that look across the supply chain? Because there's a great exercise you do in the SCOR class where you say, well, if you want a certain end of process or end of supply chain performance of say 95%, what kind of process capability do you need at all the major steps before that? And if you look at it and say, well, if everybody performed at 95% each preceding step, right, you wouldn't be able to achieve a 95% performance. And that's a good subject for another day. But an important part is understanding and managing those customer expectations. And the reasons that that's important is not only do you have all those internal linkages building up of activities, but you have that extending across your entire supply chain to your value chain. So that end-to-end visibility, collaboration, and the drivers of that are really important to understand. I know I'm picking up speed a little bit here. That's intentional because this is really to just touch on some of these things and not get into depth. And then there's opportunities certainly for questions or follow-up at another time as well. So profitability, that's now a top-level SCOR attribute. It's really critical because you need to have some level of profitability for your business to exist or your organization to exist and to keep on investing. So we have a lot of headwinds that affect that, but a supply chain, all the processes you can understand and work with and define the differences in the current state to where you need to be is going to get you further down the line to actually being able to deliver that consistently and to change. So one of the things I've done a lot of work on, and this is just an image of it, but I was really intrigued the first time I ever saw this picture. It shows the DuPont model, which is actually a financial model on the left side. It was developed by DuPont when they were trying to manage a large and growing business. And at the same time, the then CEO of DuPont took over the management of General Motors at the same time, which seems kind of wild in today's environment, but that's what happened. So they were really trying to find a way to manage businesses at a high level with a common set of metrics. They tried to be financial. So it's a well-established model that's used for investment, a lot of things today, and you can drill all the way down into different elements of performance, all the way down to the P&L, the balance sheet, all the way down into the details. It actually has a good alignment by design with the SCOR model. So scores, attributes, down to the key KPIs, down to the process metrics, align pretty well with that model. And I've done a lot of work making this actually work and proving that it's possible to do this and using it in different situations. So that's one of the things that's really powerful, especially now that SCOR has more defined, what they call economic measures, but financial measures, it even is a stronger tie to this. But, again, subject for another day, but you can really drill down to things, especially from the outside in. There's a friend of mine who's done a lot of work on something called outside in analysis, Laura Cesare, who really focuses on all these metrics. She was part of the original development of SCOR many years ago, and still embeds some of that in her work today. But she's really good at helping companies understand how you look at yourself from the outside. And one of the ways to do that is not only performance benchmarking, but around supply chains as well. But the financials are the way that we look at almost every business. So there's a really strong connection between the SCOR model and how you can use it to define supply chain and financial performance. Risk management, as we said, is huge. It's a really, really critical part of business management, supply chain management today. We really lived that during COVID and coming out of the pandemic, and risk took on a hugely different connotation and personal application, right? We were afraid to go outside. We didn't know what to do. Business models changed overnight. So a lot of stuff went on because of that, and we've learned a lot of good lessons. And SCOR is really helpful in that context because SCOR allows us to really look at how our operations run, how we perform at different points across the supply chain. And then once you understand all of that, you can start to say what else, if something changed, if my demand picture changed, or if I lost a node of the supply chain, or something happened, how would I shift the way that I execute my strategy today? Or if I had to change my strategy, what things would I change? So if you have that understanding of your supply chain, you're able to deal with everything from small risks that increase in frequency to very large catastrophic risks that may happen infrequently, but could destroy your business model, your business, could impact your employees. So it's how you define how you deal with both of those types of risk. Another one that's really important is supplier and partner management, and how you manage those relationships. So if you can come to a common way of communicating, and one of the things we're looking at more and more in my aerospace and defense business is collaboration with customers and suppliers. Because the challenges go across the value chain, there's less capacity, there's greater demand change, there's much longer lead times for certain parts and the raw materials. The only path we have is to collaborate more, collaborate on forecasting, collaborate on planning, collaborate on decisions around the prioritization of capacity across the value chain. So we're really experiencing that in a fundamental way. And as you look at the many different relationships you have between partners and suppliers, it gets pretty complex pretty fast. So SCOR gives you the ability to break that down into an understandable way and begin to communicate with your partners and suppliers in ways that you can both align around. So SCOR is really powerful, and the experiences I've had in doing it across different entities can really make a huge difference. And then add to that, again, all the digitization and information flows you need to accommodate as well. It gives you a framework to do that. And then the last one of the ways you can apply SCOR, and where I've had good experience with it, is around talent management and sustaining productivity. And when I say sustaining productivity, it's not only with what you're currently doing, but as you shift, as you make changes to your processes, as you apply different practices, as you deal with risk, you want to be able to sustain that same productivity. And because of SCOR's relationship between skills, measurements, processes, those align and they're set up in a logical way, it's fairly straightforward once you've got that established to be able to make those shifts and understand, do I need to invest more in different knowledge? I know in one large company I was with, we realized we really lacked supply chain knowledge. So we invested heavily in ASCM education and made that available to all the people in key roles. We realized that we had a gap around our knowledge of the demand side of the business, so forecasting, demand planning. So we brought in training and education on that and had those skills identified and tied to processes, and we're able to make the business case for those substantial investments and saw the return from that. And you can do that at any level in SCOR. You don't need to be in a big business. SCOR gives you that kind of association you can apply to your supply chain and make relatively straightforward decisions around it. This is just an image that comes from the SCOR model around the relationship between people, their experience and level of training, how that aligns with processes, the practices that you're using, and then how that contributes to performance. So SCOR gives you a pretty strong connection to how all those things fit together. Again, it's like building blocks. It's a model where all the things connect. It's designed for that disaggregation, aggregation of everything across the different elements of SCOR. So just want to review and reflect for a minute. When I think about these challenges, and the original article was written about applying SCOR to them, is I still think these are very applicable to SCOR, and even more so with the drive for more automation. And that automation for me includes what they call artificial intelligence, but just software. So that increased digital information, social information, and everything we deal with in terms of physical automation, and combine that with what we're trying to do around the circular economy, how we're measured by investors and other stakeholders, employees, what we need to think about in those ways. It gives us a way to bring all of those things together. So I want to make sure we keep some time for questions. So I'm just going to quickly go through this aerospace exercise and ask you guys for some input. So I know I'm asking you something where we haven't done the deep drill and how this works, but I'll kind of set it up. So hopefully it'll make some sense. So as I mentioned, one of the biggest challenges we face in aerospace right now is a shifting of demand patterns, particularly in civil aviation, You're starting to see an uptick in defense, mainly through replenishment because of different issues around the world, particularly in Ukraine. You're seeing in the development and growth, things like drone aviation, whether civil and defense. So that's speeding up. Same thing, it's affecting other industries. So we're going through a lot of change after many years, probably almost 15 years of pretty good stability. So we've been able to focus previously on being very reliable across the value chain because we didn't have a lot of change for about 10, 15 years. So after that period of time that Preston mentioned, when there was a lot of consolidation in the industry, which had differing effects, there was a long period of time where there was relative stability. And so reliability was a really big focus. Could you deliver as expected? But now we're facing all those changing dynamics. We're being pressed hard to still deliver consistently. And we're having to move around and try different things. So if you think about that, if reliability is probably not the main focus of today, although it's still very important, what of the other customer-facing attributes would be important, do you think, in the aerospace industry of today?
I would probably say the responsiveness.
Yep, I'd say responsiveness is very important.
Mm-hmm.
One of the changes that's happening, though, is we're seeing basically the timeframes of being able to source materials and the time it takes to utilize capacity suppliers changing fairly rapidly. So there might be another one in here that might even be more significant, although responsiveness and reliability would still be very important.
I would peg that as potentially agility. In some cases, there are resources that were used before have shrunk over time. So in planning, you have to recognize that and have alternatives. So it's the agility, the ability to go. I remember in a conversation I had with you about a year and a half ago, where you were trying to source parts that hadn't been made for a long time. And in fact, the two major suppliers or collaborators to make that part, one was in Europe and one was in Asia. And you had this crazy work schedule of making phone calls at 2 a.m. and all kinds of craziness. So I would say agility today is very, very important. Being able to think outside the box and still come up with something that works.
I would say so. Does everyone agree that agility might be an area to focus on today? Now, of course, cost is always very important. Assets are important. And if you look at the expanded set of SCOR attributes, certainly sustainability is very important. All of those things are important. Risk is important. But I think agility is true. And so one of the ways that we've been working on that is, so from that very chaotic time that Preston and I had spoken about maybe a year ago, where I was working, I think, 16-hour days and 100-hour weeks for a long time, which wasn't fun, is that I'm now involved more because I see the need than because I was originally part of it. But we're implementing one of the better supply chain optimization tools, rapid response from Kinaxis. And I've become I've actually been driving the US side of it around customer operations, which is kind of the last mile of the customers and the first interface they have. And one of the reasons that I've been really focused on that is, one, I had experience a few years back with it, but more importantly is because of that experience of a year ago, I'm really struggling to try to, with few tools, and the tools we had weren't very strong because they're built around reliability, is to be able to shift and to be able to see those things that were changing. And now we're able to invest and apply some new technology to the ability to plan with greater agility, to see more things, and to be able to make sense of those more quickly. And then with that, one of the things that I was in the very beginning, I didn't really touch on it, was some work I'm doing around standard work. So creating more standardized processes, because if all your processes, just like supply chains, are different, and they don't need to be, that creates a lot of friction, a lot of drag. As we've implemented this new technology, we realized that many of our processes are like that, and there's an opportunity to both simplify and to standardize the work so that it's more consistent and we can make better use of our investment. And then we can also, one of the things that's now grown to that is to apply better training to our teams so they can take advantage of all these tools. So I'm kind of coming full circle and seeing, the value of applying some of these things again. And one of the things about SCOR that I find really valuable is if you know it, it's sometimes harder for other people to understand unless they've been through the education, and especially if you're talking to colleagues that are not in supply chain. They often don't really, it doesn't really grasp, they don't grasp the concept right away, or they aren't familiar with it. But you can utilize SCOR and the processes and the techniques and the methods of SCOR without really advertising, right? It can be part of the work that you do. And that's one of the beauties of it as well. So with that, I hope I have given you guys a pretty good idea of how SCOR can be applied. And I know we're kind of at a surface level because SCOR takes a while to fully understand, but that it's reasonably practical and it's accessible from any size organization, whether you're an individual practitioner to a small business to a giant corporation. It has applicability because of the just fundamental way that it's put together and the logic, which with a little bit of effort is fairly understandable. And once you get it, the big value is applying it. So one of the challenges has been in the last few years is there's been a lot of people taking classes in SCOR and getting education, but I haven't seen as much coming out on the application of SCOR. So one of the things I urge everyone is to learn a little bit about it and start to apply it, because that's where the real value is. So I appreciate your time. Are there any follow-up questions that I can answer?
Well, hi, Peter. This is me, Sandy. How are you doing?
Hey, Sandy.
Just a couple of comments. I liked your 6 challenges, but my opinion, I think they've always been relevant, even going back 30 years, which is when I started my career in aerospace. And but what I think one thing has changed is the awareness of those challenges. I think they're much more prevalent today, especially after the pandemic. But back in the late 80s, early 90s, understanding of those challenges were just coming out. I worked at a company in England that was all cost plus. So they had no interest in using MRP to only buy what we need when we needed it. If they needed something, instead of schlepping over to the warehouse to see if they had it, they just bought more because they could always charge it back to the government. Things have certainly changed. One particular feature that came out in my memory, and thanks for waking up some dead neurons, I must say, especially with the DuPont model. I haven't seen that in a while. But one thing that came out in the late 80s, early 90s was the CALS initiative. That was the computer-aided acquisition and logistics support. And that was the first recognition, at least in aerospace, that the as-designed process needs to accommodate how to source, how to build, how to deliver, and then how to maintain once the product is fielded. And that all starts with the as design, or with the engineering group. And I think that was the first transformation in aerospace on their way into using ERP finally, which obviously finally happened. That was just my comment. So anyway, I appreciate your presentation.
Well, thank you. And one of the things that I didn't talk much about was within the model, there is a whole reverse side of SCOR. So think about all the things, and certainly maintenance and repair is a form of reverse supply chain, where you take something back in, you assess it, you break that back down into the parts that need to be replaced or maintained. There's a whole piece of SCOR that's built around that, and it's been applied actually to the Department of Defense in a number of different ways, because they've tried to solve some of those issues because they have a lot of that. And then certainly for any business, understanding your reverse supply chain, it has all the elements of your outbound supply chain, but literally just in reverse. So you can manage those, and SCOR has a lot of components to help you do that, because it just takes kind of a shift in thinking. But the challenges are different when you're trying to deconstruct something, whether it's from a recycling standpoint, or you're trying to do it for repair, or you're trying to extract and transform that return product into some other value.
Well, that's the circular economy. Exactly. Well,
absolutely. Yep. Any other questions I can answer? Well, I'm always happy to speak about any of this in more depth. the financial piece, the connection of the DuPont model to SCOR, actually something that I found really interesting. It's something that I've spent some time on doing in the real world. I haven't always been in a position to apply it, but that's one that's really interesting. And then any parts of this, you can dive more deeply into a particular example for an industry or a business. I mean, certainly we're trying to apply that to the eco-sustainability piece, but I'm a member of the chapter. So happy to talk to anybody anytime.
Thank you, Peter. It was very good. I really learned a lot, so it gave me a lot of insight to SCOR and want to know more. So I hope everybody have enjoyed. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time. Thank you everybody for joining. Wish you a very nice evening and see you next time.